Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Sanchez. I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Architecture at USC, and together with my co-host, Bhavna Sharma, who's also a recent assistant professor that joined USC School of Architecture, we would like to welcome you to this lecture series and this conversations series. This particular event has been built upon the topic of technology in the public sphere. And we really have as I would call it, a dream lineup for tonight to discuss some of these issues. I would really like to thank Dean Milton Curry and also the lectures committee to really allow for this topic to take place here at USC. This particular event, we've named it Designing Down the Barrier. And this is a term that we borrowed from architect Alastair Parvin, who has used and quoted this idea in his book, A Right to Build. Parvin challenges us designers to really think how our skills as architects allow us to reconnect with communities, with the communities that we serve. Especially at a time that is marked by economic inequality and divisive discourses that accentuate walls between different diverse communities, is an event such as this one that tries to create vantage points that engage design, theory, and practice, aiming to create bridges and not accentuate borders. The denomination of the Global South that has traditionally been equated to a global geographic condition, today could be argued more that has become an archipelago, perhaps, one that is present both within countries and within cities. The edges of such an archipelago is accentuated by lack of access and the creation of barriers, right? It's also founded on the idea of the lack of capital and lack of literacy. And perhaps the most important one is the lack to a common ground. It is precisely that common ground that we want to build here today. So I want to invite my co-host, Bhavna Sharma, to introduce the speakers that we'll have this evening. Thank you.
So as Jose mentioned, we have three wonderful speakers joining us today. We have Catie Newell from the University of Michigan College of Architecture and Planning. Catie is the director of the Master of Science in Digital and Material Technologies and is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan's Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. She's also a founding principal of Alibi Studio based in Detroit. We also have joining us Yanni Loukissas from Georgia Institute of Technology, and he's based in the School of Literature and Media and Communication. He's an assistant professor of digital media, and where he directs the local data design lab. And finally, we have Virginia Fratello from San Jose State University in the Department of Design. Virginia is an architect, artist, and educator, and a partner in the award-winning design studio Royal San Fratello. She's also co-founder of a startup company called Emerging Objects. Let's welcome our speakers.
Thank you for having me. I'm Catie Newell, for those of you who don't know which one of us is which. I'm delighted to be here tonight and to be part of this conversation. I took the chance in putting this very quick slideshow together to think a little bit. I'll touch lightly on some of my own work, but some of the ideas that I think even my own practice is trying to figure out in this particular moment in time and what we can do with technology. Because here's the thing, I actually think we're at a moment where we can make anything. And that we is a collective we. It is our world of makers, doers, and creators. We are at a moment now where we can do almost anything. I have full confidence in the skills and the know-how within the world of digital technologies. We can put millions of pieces together. We can roll over the ground robotically. We can see things that aren't actually there, and we can teach machines to pick up after themselves. And we can change the lighting. It's an impressive time in the world of computation and fabrication where all the tools have been sharpened or coded and are standing ready for us. We can make anything, technically only that is. But we can't just make anything. Now more than ever, we are required to give more greatly to the world where there's an uncertain future for organized human life in the environment that we have a very complicated relationship with. Instead, it's the very local stories, the local truths, and the local cultures that must lead the way for us. Why is this? Because it seems like the one thing that the digital cannot provide entirely on its own is a location in place, in geography, and in the story of the superlocal. For the most part, the technologies thriving in the architectural disciplines and their current outputs, they have a certain aesthetic. These outputs are often true to the machine, true to the material, true to the code that makes the unreal possible. This has become recognizable, but the one thing that is still youthful in all of this is the material culture. And it's beginning to become very present. Our works do not yet, though, however, have not yet become embedded in our memory. It is not yet carried in the story of generations. It's not yet what someone passes every time they come home from afar. The works are seeing a hard time, but they have not yet seen hard times that have come and then also go. We haven't yet figured out how it is that we touch something as if we miss it, how long it is until it has its own disappearance, or how to assess its long-term value. Technologies has raised the bar of expectation and shine and wonderment, one that has increased but has access to still feeling scarce. For example, finding things only in the institutions, the corporations, or that which is well-funded. But it is in fact the local that actually carries all of the value. That value is in the depth of the site. It is in the richness of the culture contingencies, it is in the heart, and it is in the essence of the digital technologies that cannot, at least yet, it is in the essence the digital technologies cannot, at least yet, give us that sort of heart. And so what it is that we should be absolutely honored to be invited in, to be fully absorbed into any specific site, geographies, and stories. In fact, those should be the crucial means by which we evaluate our work moving forward. How well has the work listened? Have we used the local materials, the methods, the means? Does it have something to do with that which is inexplicable? Does it feel inexplicable, or does it feel just right to the site? Does it have an aura and a sense of belonging? Is it something that actually needs to be there? I can feel this in the work that I'm doing right now. I have a split sort of brain, a brain of investigations as I'm living a sort of multi-experiment, how to practice life right now. Between sites and lab, I actually see matter, physical matter, in multiple locations. The nature of some of my research is by default tied to the lab, somewhere where there are these articulate machines, kilns, and materials, where the research is actually focusing on concentrating on the material alone and daring to make it differently. But what we have seen is that there is a very critical, intangible moment, and that's when the experiments that are housed in the lab have taken on a new character, and one with new essence is when we actually switch to giving them the local ingredients, when they are rooted in a place where they came from and where they are made, when they are literally made out of the materials that are on their sites, and suddenly they have place. What it is that they're literally reflecting matters, they're actually somewhere, and the material attributes do not rest on their creation alone, but what surrounds them. It is the value there that gives them meaning. And I've seen this in the same intangible moment in the quest for actually choosing the right material or the right technology. Decisions have come and drastically changed because something in the site needed it to, something in the local context asked for it to be paid attention to. So what started here as an investigation for a facade system, labored closely over in codes and scripts and hacking a water jet to turn entirely new missions, turned into an entirely new mission when the site that it was on lost 44 trees during a miscommunication between the city and the energy company. Decisions that were once self-referential to the technology that it could be used suddenly became and had a new value that now was all became committed to help remedy a heartache that was given to that whole neighborhood. The studio instead now has been moved to the site, meaning literally our place of working, so that the valuable decisions are made in the presence of the stories in a building that is over 104 years old, and the replacement of its mourned lost trees. And I have understood the tiny details between what was made by a machine and what was made by hand, where there was computation involved and where there was site construction instead and site reconstruction. And even in all of these acts that have been cross-pollinated, how it was made was not at all the question, but instead what mattered was the local light, the local site, and the local response. It's a delightfully messy time where learning comes not just with the possibilities of technique and material, but with the possibilities of being good citizens and how we deploy this moment of make anything potential. Pay careful attention in a world that we need to make less. For right now, we need less waste, less harm to the environment, less clutter, with intentions for more value, worth, and health. What we are labeling over is that which will be out in the world. Note carefully that we are making the very near future. These sites, these contexts are asking us to make things that are neither digital nor the analog, that are neither new nor old, and something that neither of these, either of these or any of these, can do on their own. We have entered the time where the tool is no longer what needs to be its own thing, but must fall into the duty to pay service to the context and its users. I'm suggesting that while we try to make value for local communities with our technologies, is it in fact the local communities that are giving our technologies the value? It is in fact the greatest next step for the crucial understanding and assessment of all of our digital technologies. These are the critical stakes at play when choosing to make somewhere instead of choosing to make anything. Thanks.
Okay. I want to thank you all for having me here tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I am what I sometimes refer to as a renegade architect. I was an architect in my former life, and now I teach in a program in digital media, but architecture shapes a lot of what I do today, and I hope that what I'm going to talk about today can kind of in turn help shape the way you all think about your architecture. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of points at the core of a new book that just came out called All Data Are Local. And even in that title, I think you see a hint of some of that architectural sensibility. And it's really a book about what does it mean to think critically within our data-driven society. And it's really, I'm thrilled that architects are interested in this, but it's really about anyone who wants to work effectively, but also ethically with data. Let's see. So I began writing this book around 2012. And now looking back on that, it seems like another era, right? Because at the time we had this sense that that big data was going to be transformative. It was on the verge of transforming science, business, government, and certainly design. A lot has changed. I think societally we've come to accept that data and algorithms are not only very important and are in the headlines, but that they are capable of doing a lot of harm, right? This idea that big data has this kind of uncompromised potential seems quaint. And we realize there's a dangerous side to data, that there are biases, that there are absences, that there are limitations, unanticipated impacts, and even blatant abuse. Data can be racist, data can be sexist, or simply fake. And the examples run the gamut from election hacking to p-hacking. And here are just a couple of examples. But I don't think we're ready to give up on data as a way of knowing in the world, right? So how do we kind of salvage and discover new, more responsible ways of working with data? And that's really what my work is about. And my argument is summed up by the title of the book. And what I mean when I say that all data are local is that data are created by people in a place at a time, working within existing organizations, using the tools at hand, often for audiences that are disciplined to receive them. And that if we treat data as such, not as abstract facts, but as cultural artifacts, then we can find new ways of working with them. Now, this work builds on a long history of feminist and post-colonial critiques of notions of objectivity that have kind of been built up in areas like science and technology studies. But I think kind of more than ever, we need those ways of thinking today. Now, I'm going to give you a really simple example that I like to talk about, and in this case, I think it's apropos because it starts with a building, and not all of my examples do. Who here has been to this building? I'm sure even if you haven't, you recognize it, the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. Not too long ago, if you wanted data, this is where you went, right? This kind of collection. And today we expect to get data without going anywhere in particular. We expect the data to come to us, right? So recently I was doing a project on the collections of the New York Public Library. And I was examining this. Who has a guess what this is? Morse code. Not quite, but it is a kind of code. It's a date. So day, month, and year. Or if you're from Europe, year, month, month, day, month, year. And I was doing a little visualization project where I was kind of looking at all of the objects that are in a collection like the New York Public Library. Now, the New York Public Library is one of the most well-funded research collections in the country, if not the world. And they have objects from all over, and not just books. They have old magazines, newspapers, photographs. I think they even have Winnie the Pooh. And each one has a date associated with it, when that object was made. And we would expect to be able to get all those dates and line up all those artifacts on something like a timeline. The problem is the people who wrote those dates had very different ideas about what a date should look like. How many different ways do you think there are of writing the date that I found in the New York Public Library? Does anybody want to guess? How many different ways of writing the date? Here's one. How many others do you think there are? Just shout out. 500? 15? That's a good, I don't think I've heard a guess that high before. They're actually about 1,719. Now, this is the number that my algorithm returned. There may be more. I mean, my algorithm made a lot of assumptions. And if you look more closely, you see things like this. And when you see them, they're quite human, right? There's approximations, right? There's things that are reissued. Now, in parentheses, you see the number of times that date was used. That date format, right? So all these, in case this is confusing to anyone, those underscores, those lines are variables, so different values. So each time that date format is used, there's put like a different number in there. One has the name of the printer and just June, abbreviation for June. There are question marks. There are other languages. There's a lot of Roman numerals. So you get the sense that immediately looking at these that, you know, people were doing the best they could. Now, often when we get a data set like this, we do what? We try to clean it. And what does that mean? It means kind of getting rid of anything that doesn't conform to our expectation. Now, it's hard to find a lowest common denominator here. And in fact, what I would argue is that there's a lot of important cultural history, not just in the objects in the New York Public Library, but in this kind of information, in the data on those objects, right? And one way of thinking about it, I think comes from an anthropologist named Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas wrote a whole book about dirt called Purity and Danger. And so I think we can bring some of those concepts to bear on what data scientists do and data visualization artists do when they try to normalize or clean these data sets. She says, you know, there's not actually, there's no such thing as dirt in an objective sense. Dirt is something relative. If I'm eating a sandwich that has, I don't know, mustard on it, that mustard's not dirt. But if I I dripped some on my beautiful suit. Oh, that's dirt, right? So the same thing goes for data. What we perceive as dirt in data sets is really just data out of place. And I think this kind of gets to my argument that data has a lot to do with place. And for that reason, I think society needs a lot of help from architects who know and understand place and context and how to think about them. I've advocated for making a switch from the phrase data set. You see this everywhere now, data sets. But what does a data set imply? It implies something that's complete, it's closed, it's self-contained, you can take it anywhere. But increasingly we're finding that we can't so easily take data sets anywhere and interpret them in effective ways. And if you take those date formats as an example, interpreting them outside the context of their creation is quite difficult. So what if we transition from talking about data sets to talking about data settings, talking about the places, the situations in which data are created, seeing data as part of a larger knowledge system that uses those data, that relies upon them, but the data are not separate from that system. So librarians at the New York Public Library know how to use those date formats and work with them. They've been doing it for a long time. But if we try to extract those data, it might not be so easy. Now, people ask me, what do you mean by data? And I think there's a lot of answers to this question. And I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about kind of what my approach to it is. But I really like this definition from Christine Borgman and Michael Buckland, who work in information studies. And they say, like dirt, data is also a rhetorical category. Data don't really have that many essential qualities. And actually, anything that we take as evidence in support of some claim, that becomes data. So she has this great example. She says, imagine you're digging around your parents' attic and you find a box of photographs. Is that inherently data? No. But if you start making claims about the trends in clothing from the photos, or you start making claims about your family history, or maybe about the mechanics of the camera that took those photographs, suddenly the photos become data, right? So I think this is really important, that anything can become data. But I think it leaves something out. And it's a notion that I think is well characterized by a philosopher and sociologist of science and technology named Bruno Latour, that some of you might have heard of. He had this kind of phrase for talking about data. He actually calls data inscriptions, and he says they're immutable mobiles. What does that mean? Well, it kind of means what he says, that there are things that you can move from one place to another, and they don't change when you move them. And often we expect to use data at a distance. But as I've said, data sets don't move so easily. So I'd like to suggest that we think of data as allegedly mobile evidence. But the truth is it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of context in order to use data that were made by people and in places at a distance from yourself. I want to say, before I wrap up, I want to say a couple words about the stakes here. There's a long history of, first of all, architects working with digital media. Here's a quote from Nicholas Negroponte, who's kind of been in the news again more recently, but not for this work. He wrote a book called Being Digital a while ago that had a lot of impact, in which he prophesized that being digital was going to mean less and less dependence upon being in a specific place at a specific time. And eventually the point that place itself was going to be transmissible. And this kind of place agnosticism has kind of resonated throughout digital culture, that it doesn't matter where you are. And no matter who you are or where you are, you're just a user in the face of digital technologies. Anita Chan calls it the myth of digital universalism. And I'm going to read a little bit from my book just to give you a kind of flavor of how I write about this and why it's meaningful in relationship to data. So I write, the diversity and prosperity of the world's varied and contingent digital practices depend on our acceptance of data's locality. In fact, the stakes for the future of the internet could not be higher. If left unchallenged, digital universalism could become a new kind of colonialism in which practitioners at the periphery are made to conform to the expectations of a dominant technological culture. I mean, imagine if we tell everyone how they have to write the date. As I argue in this book, learning to look at the local conditions of data can be a form of resistance to the ideology of digital universalism and the threat of erasure that it poses to myriad data cultures and ways of knowing. So to wrap up, I'd like to leave you with this message. As you seek to explore the world, data can be a wonderful starting point, an opportunity, a bridge, in fact, and an opportunity to get closer to the people and places beyond data. But do not mistake the availability of data as permission to remain at a distance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation, Dean Curry and Jose and the committee. I'm delighted to be here and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Catie is already talking about common ground. Yanni has talked about dirt in data, and I'm going to talk about mud. So we already have, I think, a departure point for our discussion on technology. I'd like to just present two projects tonight. Which exist at the border between the United States and Mexico, or the barrier, the current border and the historic border. And we call these Future Frontiers projects from the borderlands. In the last 3 years, we've undertaken a project called Mud Frontiers, and we call it Frontiers, of course, because it takes place at the frontier between the United States and Mexico, but also because we're operating at technological frontiers as well. On the 40th anniversary of Smithsonian Magazine, they wrote an article that said 40 things you need to know about the next 40 years. And number one on that list was that sophisticated buildings will be made out of mud. And it's our aim to make this prediction come true. The Mud Frontier project looks both back and forward. We're looking at traditional and ubiquitous building materials and methods such as puddled mud, and we're examining the challenges associated with bringing robotic manufacturing to the frontier and ways in which 3D modeling and designing can become more democratic through the development of a software app that runs in the cloud. To start this project, we worked with students at the University of El Paso, Texas, to seek out local sources of clay in both Juarez and El Paso. The students processed the clay using very traditional techniques of crushing, sifting, and pulverizing to create a wet clay body that we could use as the material source for the robotically manufactured vessels and future buildings which would be a part of this project. One thing we discovered through our search for wild clay in this region was that there was incredible variety within the complexion of the soil and the ground in this region. And we gave the students access to a software app that we've been developing, which would allow them to design in the cloud on their computer, simply using these slide bars. So they're designing using the G code so that they can print directly from this file. And in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, they're able to 3D print an object for the first time, which you can see here. This is a video of one of the students who had never modeled anything in the computer and never 3D printed anything, all within a matter of 2 or 3 hours. And these students produced over 170 objects using the varied complex clays that they excavated from the region. And they explored the colors and textures and different shapes and sizes. Parallel to that investigation, we were working on a mesa overlooking Juarez with soil, clay, straw, and water, and mixing that to make large-scale fabrications using a robotic arm to extrude the clay, to make surfaces that have this kind of texture. And ultimately an enclosure, which you can see here, that is about, I think, 8 feet tall by 6 feet in diameter, and is structured with this Pizzelli interior. So you can go inside it. It's kind of like a shrug or an envelope that embraces you. And here you can see it in juxtaposition to the 170 vessels that the students made. For phase 2 of the Mud Frontier project, we moved our fabrication site to southern Colorado, along the historic border between the United States and Mexico. And here we're addressing mobility, ubiquity, and democracy within additive manufacturing. We have a mobile, lightweight, robotic 3D printing setup that can easily be transported to the field or the job site. The 3D printer can be combined with a continuous flow hopper that can print wall sections and enclosures up to 7.5 feet in diameter and 8 feet tall, structures that are considerably larger than the printer itself. The printer is very lightweight. It weighs less than 100 pounds, so it can be picked up by 1 or 2 people and relocated in order to continue printing. The materials we're using are mud and clay, which are wild and locally sourced from the print sites, where there's a tradition of building with adobe. The mud is free, it can be dug directly from the ground or surrounding regions where the walls and enclosures are being printed. And we're using our custom software to design the walls and the enclosures printed by the printer. The software runs in the cloud. We can drive the robot with our phone. It's easy to use, and it automatically generates G-code files. So we can design a room for 3D printing in a matter of minutes. This is our robotic setup. So here you can see we're excavating the local, what we're calling wild clay. And we are excavating from sites that we are recommended to dig on based on the kind of tacit knowledge of generations of families who have built houses out of adobe here. And we conceptualize these experiments under 4 themes: the lookout, the hearth, the beacon, and the kiln. The kiln explores several of these techniques, including undulating and interlocking mud deposition to create structural and insulative walls. It's an area that draws in oxygen, and we use it to fire other smaller pottery pieces. The lookout is an exploration in structure. It's a 3D printed staircase made entirely of mud. It has a dense network of undulating coils that you can walk on. The beacon explores how texture and the undulation of a single coil of mud can produce the thinnest wall possible for enclosure. These coils are then illuminated at night, contrasting the difference between concave and convex. And the hearth is an interior that holds a fireplace that burns juniper. It's surrounded by a mud bench, and it explores the haptic and decorative aspects of structure. This project unearths and re-examines ancient building traditions and materials used in the borderlands for thousands of years, and it uses 21st century technology and craft coupled with local skills to create emerging and new traditions. The second project I'd like to share with you is a border wall teeter-totter, and I'd like to talk about that through the lens of how we arrived at this project. So I'm going to explain to you how to build a teeter-totter. The first thing you have to do is choose a site. So for our site, we chose the border wall between Anapra, Mexico, and Sunland Park, New Mexico. It's a location where the village of Anapra comes up to 3 feet within the border wall, and there are many families with children living in this village. On the United States of the wall, there is also a close residential neighborhood, but it's a little bit further away, a couple of 100 feet away. And this section of the border wall was built in 2017 under the Secure Fence Act signed into law by George W. Bush. It is not built under our current president. Now, when you're designing a teeter-totter, it's important to decide how thrilling or possibly dangerous the ride should be. So in planning our teeter-totter, we made sure that when one side was touching the ground, the other side was lifted up twice as tall as the fulcrum in the middle. Now, the wall in Anapra is 18 feet tall, and so in our early renderings, we were showing people lifted up into the air 20 feet. Dangerously high, right? But tremendously thrilling, which is why we were probably never able to get permission to do this project. And we did ask many times. In subsequent proposals and drawings, we made a more realistic and less dangerous proposal for the teeter-totter. Ultimately, it is 14 feet long. The fulcrum is 2 feet above the ground, and this allows riders to go 4 feet up into the air so that your feet don't touch the ground, because that's part of the thrill of riding a teeter-totter, right? We designed the teeter-totter to slide through the 4-inch gaps between the metal posts and fastening it to the wall's horizontal base. The seats and handlebars are able to be quickly attached from the other side of the wall. This wall is designed much like a guardrail on a stair. A baby cannot put his head through so that he wouldn't get it stuck and be able to not pull it back through. But the openings are big enough for you to put your hand or a slender object through. So when you're designing your teeter-totter, you have to consider all the details. We worked with Collective Chopeki and Taller Herreria in Ciudad Juarez to fabricate the teeter-totters. And they helped us devise the best details for smuggling in our design on the border. And you can see here the detail of how the fulcrum rests on the steel angle that connects the metal post to the border wall. Our pink fulcrum slides onto the angle. It has a notch, and it's held in place with a key that is tightened from the Mexico side of the border. The seats are banana bicycle seats. They're cushioned and they're soft, so it's not painful when you hit the ground. They also have sparkles and silver stripes because you have to have a little bit of levity. It is fun and play after all, right? And even though seesaws can be dangerous, you have to trust that the person on the other side is not going to do anything erratic or unkind to hurt you. Handles, preferably with rubber grips, are useful, and a horn allows you to get the attention of the person on the other side. Color. Color is always important for designers. It's usually the first thing we see, and it has emotional power. And when used in the right way, it can send a message. The pink crosses here are memorials to the women who were killed in the femicides during the time of violence in Juarez in the 1990s. And the people who live in Juarez know what this color means. And we painted our teeter-totter this color as a form of resistance. And finally, of course, you have to ride the teeter-totter. So on July 28th at dusk, we slipped the teeter-totters through the border wall between Anapra and Sunland City to ride the border between the United States and Mexico. And we moved quickly because we knew we might only have a few minutes to do this before the Border Patrol showed up and shut us down. Ultimately, we weren't stopped, and we had the opportunity to spend time with the families on the Mexico side of the border, to share in our common humanity, and to see the faces of the people who are affected by the horror of this wall every day. For 40 minutes, we were able to show the world that play can be an act of resistance. This event was filled with joy and excitement and togetherness. The wall became a literal fulcrum for U.S.-Mexico relations, and children and adults were connected in meaningful ways on both sides of the border, with the recognition that actions that take place on one side have a direct consequence for the other side. We were never able to get official permission to install the teeter-totters at the border, but architecture doesn't always need to ask permission, and design can convey both horror and joy simultaneously. These inexpensive pink sticks, wielded by mothers and children, rendered this barrier, erected by a government at the cost of millions of dollars, impotent and useless. Architects should not design walls, but the spaces in between them. And sometimes it doesn't take very much to have a very big impact.
I'm going to invite the speakers to join us. There we go. Maybe I'll start, if that's okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations and the very provocative short statements that I think that were very pertinent to the call, in a way, in the brief of kind of designing down the barrier. I want to start with Catie and with Virginia, maybe, because I see a fundamental maybe shift in the work. I see a beautiful transition from experiments, especially that have to do with technology, that have occupied galleries in the past, in a way. But there seem to be finding kind of a very genuine kind of place and almost a form of entanglement with the locations in which they're kind of situated. And if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on that reflection, if you see that being kind of a trajectory that you want to kind of pursue further, or is something that you feel like a deep connection that is important for you in your work?
And I think that's certainly a very true statement in terms of things having moved from either being in a lab or exhibition to very much so being on site. And to be honest, I actually think that a lot of my work is invested in things that are already existing before itself, and that's actually where it ends up finding a true sort of richness, or in a way, a sort of reason for being, like a reason to make decisions, or reason to actually take up something that matters. And so a lot of times, I think, I think this maybe comes out in both of our works, but it boils down to something where there really is a deep meaning in terms of material choice or a technique of making, that perhaps there may be another way to make it either more efficiently, or to take 2 hours less, or to cost, $50 less per square foot, but in the end, it actually ends up having that much more value because it's placed somewhere, and it actually ends up being something that recognizes a particular moment in time or a particular location. So I think as some of our work increases, not just in scale, but in sort of its efforts of what it can do, I think the sort of exhibition sense or in a gallery is only left to demonstrate or document the work that was done elsewhere, that elsewhere is far more important.
I think I'll speak specifically to our projects, which are made of soil and mud and clay. We have a long history of working with this material. 15 years ago, we built the Prada Marfa in Valentine, Texas, out of adobe, and we built a house out of adobe. And this is a material that is very local to southern Colorado. And in the southeast where I'm from, we're not building with adobe, but historically the French would build with rammed earth there. So this is a very traditional material. It's a material that exists everywhere in the world. It's rural, it's urban, it's completely ubiquitous, but of course its makeup is different in every part of the world. And so for us, we know we want to work with this material, and we designed the robot to print clay, to print soil. So the material came first with the knowledge that it is everywhere, and everyone would have access to this material. It's free, but everyone would have to develop their own recipe or formula just because we have an inherently different makeup in terms of sand and loam, et cetera, and the moisture in the clay. So for us, it often starts with material, maybe more than context. Of course, not with the border wall. That is obviously context-driven completely. So the material comes first, and then the technology second. And it was interesting to hear you talk about data being local, because I tend to think about our software as being global. But it's not, is it? Yeah.
So I'm just going to follow up on that. I thought there was a really interesting intersection regarding natural materials. So big data is actually an emerging topic in natural materials, which improves the understanding as well as increases access to information about the types of materials available to designers and engineers around the world. And Yanni, I wanted to ask if you see sort of emerging technology eliminating or reducing the barrier of access to this type of information, and if that will lead to development of a new design language.
So I think access is important, but I think we can't expect, I think too often we expect a kind of frictionless access, a kind of ubiquitous access, and that somehow by having data and making that data available, that's going to lower the barrier for everyone. But the truth is that data are always a starting point. Actually, the data is a Latin term which originally meant that which was given, the kind of, and it was meant to suggest the starting point for an argument. So I think data are a starting point, and we need to have a lot of in-depth knowledge in order to use that data effectively. So one way I like to position, one metaphor I'd like to use is, imagine that data are like the index to a book. Indexes are great. And they can help us navigate a lengthy and complex book and find the material that we want. But without the book itself, the index may tell you something about what you're going to find in the book, but the index can't really stand on its own. So anytime you encounter a data set, you have to ask, what's the broader knowledge system of which this data is a part? And I think we have to make sure that we are educating people and giving them that depth of knowledge about materials or whatever the topic is, so that they can work effectively with those data. Because data are really just indexes. That's what they are. And so you all are, and I'm talking to the students out there who kind of have a lot of important work to do in kind of learning your trades and learning about materials. And you can't rely on just having access to the data alone to kind of do your job.
So I find some of the statements that you're adding very provocative, especially a critique of universalism. And I somehow kind of connected with some of the work of Shoshana Zuboff that seems to be, in a way, denouncing the kind of almost totalitarian challenges that we're seeing of this new platform age, right? and I find that very scary. I find that for someone that is also kind of participating on digital work, we don't seem to be moving away from the digital. We seem to be still kind of embracing and working with it. But there seems to be a new code of ethics or a new kind of awareness that seems to be emerging from, and I think that I found it exciting that you mention ethics in this context, right? Do you see that it seems like very counterintuitive to the economics of data to kind of create more friction or to start thinking of privacy again? Is there any, I mean, in a way my question is there any hope? Is there any real avenues to kind of reinstate some of what has been lost in the trajectory, or do you think that we're already crossed that line?
I am optimistic, and I think the book is an optimistic one. And I wrote it because I do think we can find new ways of working with data that, as long as we're willing to put aside some of these ideas like place agnosticism. And I would think that an audience of architects would be kind of thrilled to hear that place still matters in the digital age. It matters where you are. I mean, even every time you pick up your smartphone and look at it, you're somewhere. Data is not, we have this fantasy that data is nowhere or everywhere. It's always somewhere. We're always somewhere when we're encountering data or making it. And those places matter. And I think it's our job to figure out how does it matter and to convey those those contingencies. Briefly, I want to mention a project that I'm working on now that tries to offer a way forward. It's a collaboration with an artist named Jared Thorpe. It's called the Map Room. And the idea is to develop a distributed system of spaces for map making that helps people. These are spaces in which people with varying levels of technical aptitude can make maps together collaboratively. And these maps of the places they live, bring together existent data, maybe from the census, maybe collected by their local counties or cities, bring those data sets together with their own local knowledge about those places and combine them into a single map. And these are hand-drawn maps. They're guided by a computer, by a projection system, but they're hand-drawn. And I think these are the kinds of spaces where we can kind of reconcile data with broader systems of knowledge and help people to think critically about data. Because when you're looking at data about a place where you live, you're then in the position to say, hey, there's something missing from that data set, or I know things that aren't in the data. And I think those are the moments when people say, yes, these data are useful, but they're not the whole picture.
Just following up on what you said originally in response to my question, I immediately thought of traditional knowledge base as a source of information. And I was very excited to hear that, even as an engineer, that's where we should be turning to when we're looking at using natural materials. So I wanted to ask Catie and Virginia how you see sort of the intersection between that type of knowledge that you come across in your practice and its role in sort of combining with technology and digital media in expressing these new types of architecture.
I think for us, this is a really great example, because when we're digging soil for printing the mud structures, we get it from this one spot right across from the cemetery in this little tiny town called Encinitas, because we know that's where the best adobe soil is. But we know that from fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, et cetera. And when we are 3D printing our pottery, we're using a micaceous clay, which is beautiful. It has mica in it, and it shimmers and it sparkles. And we know where to get that clay because a friend of ours who is a Native American from Taos Pueblo showed us where his father and his grandfather excavated the clay, this golden clay, which is sitting on top of this mountain, which is very hard to get to. So we're relying on that local data set, right, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. or in anyone else's memory outside of that specific location. And that's been so important to us. And of course, then we combine that with the G code, which I can share with anyone in the world, everyone in this room, and you can print the same vessel, right? But you're not going to have my great-great-grandfather's clay, right?
It's interesting. I think, in the way that we approach it, we're sort of always looking to what has already been on a site or is already there as a kind of guidance to figure out how to create something that feels very familiar and at the same time extremely unfamiliar. So it is perhaps a different way of seeing, the barn structure that I showed is, of course, a 100-year-old barn made in a certain way. We lean very heavily on the knowledge of those around us in terms of how to know things in terms of why its foundation was damaged or where the wood actually came from in order to be able to make alterations to it that would structurally be possible. But at the same time, I think there was a constant effort to add something else that read the things that were very present. So for us, we do a lot of things even for just sort of like the effects of day and night or the seasonal conditions or even the strange stories that are starting to thread through the community about something that may either be a bit mournful or maybe might be something that's seen more of kind of like damage or destruction as a way to kind of cue into a moment to kind of find something that marks the knowledge set that's already there, but ask for it to be seen in a way that's unexpected too. And so it in a way wants to add to that story, and at the same time it also kind of asks, until our more recent works that are now much bigger, everything we did also just vaporized and disappeared. Like I was hoping to kind of mark that time, mark that knowledge, and assume that it as well was going to go through transition and sort of wipe away. Maybe this goes back a little bit to the first question too. We're at a moment in trying to decide when the work needs to stay permanent, and I think that's actually also a very different condition when we're talking about adding something to a local site or to a community, where it's no longer, even in an exhibition style, meant to say something and go away or become archival or go somewhere else, and instead is meant to stay there forever. So I think the kind of knowledge that we're searching for is one that keys absolutely into the context, but looks to add to it without being outside of it, if that makes sense.
The creation of new craft traditions, right, that use those traditional materials. Maybe they look at traditional forms or ways of assembly, but they're transformed because of the new way we might occupy space, right? Or so the new program, or the fact that it's also just research, right? And that's liberating, right? Because you can explore this new craft tradition without the consequence of having to make something that you need to live in for the next 100 years, right?
I think that one of the key arguments that have been put forward today has been that many of these projects don't seem to argue themselves through the way we make things, in a way. There seems to be something else that really kind of propels the energy in the case of the capturing of through ambience or through kind of local codes, or in the case of like the actual material. There's definitely a narrative that the project puts together that definitely doesn't come from the fact that it's, perhaps a parametric or a kind of a particular technique. But in many ways, for a moment, I would like to go back to a little bit of a different orientation that I see that it's been put on technology, especially with your project, Virginia. Because I see that there's a kind of a great way in which you subvert traditional parametric tools in a way, where parametric tools seem to be searching a possibility space of buildings and variations to kind of arrive to kind of a singular, kind of almost optimized perfect solution that would be kind of checked by a client and move forward. You really kind of create a parametric tool that is serving the many, right? That it's able to sample the local information and not suggest that one is better than the other one, but perhaps that all have a different meaning and a different value in a different way, right? And I think that there's a profound kind of recontextualization of the tool that I don't see that you argue for in the work, but it's read through there. I wonder if you have any kind of reflection on that.
I think one thing that sets us apart in terms of thinking about parametric design and the way we talk about it is that we're not looking for optimization at all, ever. Because in some ways, when you're, like if you're writing a paper about parametrically optimizing the building facade, then you have to explain how this is faster and how it's less expensive. And it's just a race to the bottom then. And we're not interested in that race to the bottom, who can be fastest and who can be cheapest and who can save the most money. And so we're more interested in the novelty of what we can make. We're interested in the materials that we're using. We're interested in the traditions that we can bring forward. And I think those are the things that we're looking at. And that's why we're operating a little bit outside of what one might expect.
This is a question for all the speakers. How do you see technology playing a role in terms of engaging communities in design of space? So is there an opportunity in each of your sort of disciplines to engage community in a unique way through the use of technology?
I guess I can say something about that. Coming back to the map room project I mentioned, I think that often technology, we see technology, we think of technology as the tool of experts. But I do think that everybody is an expert in something. And we need to find ways to connect all the data that we have back to the places and the people who kind of know those things. And I was talking earlier with a colleague today about how do we bring census data back to the communities that they're extracted from, and think about how those communities can use that data and combine it with their own local knowledge about those places. And I think we need to be thinking about the technologies that let people do that, rather than just the technologies that consolidate data in certain institutions of power, so that only the few can kind of see everyone and try to predict or control what people are doing kind of based on those data. So see data less as just the tools of these kind of centers of control.
We had a Kickstarter campaign about 2 years ago to develop this organization called The Bottery, where we would bring 3D printing to everyone, to our community, and maybe this would be franchised and rolled out across the country. And we didn't get enough money to do that. We did develop the software, which I showed earlier, and we do deliver that software to middle school students and high school students and community colleges and universities around the country. And I do a 3D printing demonstration for elementary school students in my community every year, and they get it. It's amazing that a 6 or a 7 or an 8-year-old can look at the 3D printer, look at the 3D modeling software and say, oh, that's like Minecraft. And I can imagine that pretty quickly, those kids, if they had access to a 3D printer in their 2nd grade classroom, they would be printing their Minecraft worlds like this. So I think we're really close to reaching out to larger communities that have not had access to these emerging technologies. And I think that within the next few years, it will happen.
I'm a very introverted maker. And I think through with the things, it's been admirable to listen to the way that both of you, the data and also how it becomes, I think of also the 170 pots, how easy it was to make those, and the softwares that are so usable. I think in the way that I work, I tend to actually bring community in. begins as actually a very small number. It's because I literally work on the sites that I'm in. I sort of move. I joke that my studio is my pickup truck and whatever I bring, and sometimes that means I've made something, very elaborate with some technology and brought it to site. Sometimes it means something's made on site. Sometimes I usually don't talk about the way I make something. It's more left as a mystery. But the assembly process, because it happens slowly, usually starts to involve all my neighbors or whoever's involved in the city or the city council and that sort of thing. And it actually starts to become conversations where we're trying to pull off something like slicing a barn into 2 pieces, or saving a building that has no roof, so it's technically illegal to be in the city of Detroit. If it has no roof, it can be demoed at any time. It's just a law. And so we actually just very carefully work with the premise of trying to save what's there, as a way to kind of make something for the community or save something in the community, despite the ways that we might be bringing something otherwise made with technology, or that the kind of things that we have drawn have come through that way. So it tends to actually be more of bringing the sort of slowness and ability to do it as what ends up being left as a project that's made by a very small community and those who are also around, but is also kind of left as a gift to that community, maybe as a hint of what is possible, despite the way that it would be made.
So I think that we would like to open it to the floor. If you want to join the conversation, if you have any questions, we will be happy to answer and maybe kind of talk around those questions. Maybe I'll give you a little bit of time and maybe do one more question while you warm up.
Can I respond to?
Sure.
I just in listening and I'm trying to think about how do we kind of bridge between these different discourses a bit, and thinking about what it takes to make architecture, and it takes more than one person, and I think that's really important to the practice, that one person usually can't make a building, and I think when it comes to digital media, often there's this assumption that it's one person and one computer, and that there's this going back to people like Vannevar Bush. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Vannevar Bush, and this notion of how the computer should work, that it should be this kind of control center from which you can access any information you want. And without anyone's help, you can kind of make decisions and learn things and predict things. And I think that, how can digital media learn from the model of architecture as more of a distributed practice, one that relies on many people, and what would it look like if digital technologies, we expected them to work more like that?
Do we have? Yeah? Should I? Let me just.
Hi, thank you very much for your inputs and contributions. I have a question regarding data and money, because I totally appreciate, and I'm totally on your side when you talk about how do we collect data or generate data with communities and the knowledge of local people that actually should serve these people as well. But the way, the data world we know is very much driven by profits and money. So, the map project that you described kind of illustrates this in a very nice way, because you were saying that these people generate their own maps with their knowledge of their neighborhoods and things like that. I'm pretty sure that there's at this moment some person at Google developing an algorithm that extracts these kind of informations and makes money out of it. So I was wondering, do you have any idea how not just the distribution of knowledge and data can be in a more kind of local and fair way, but also if there has to be made money out of that, how we can distribute the money made out of data in a more kind of equitable way.
So it's a difficult question. There are a lot of people that are thinking about this. I think recently Jared Lettner has had a piece in the New York Times about how to redistribute money created through surveillance capitalism. You know, I mean, I'm coming from a position where I think we should be trying to make less money from data, and I think usually the expectation that digital technology should work anywhere and for anyone is really a capitalist argument. It's that we want to sell our software or our data to as many people as possible. And therefore, we're going to make this argument that anyone can use it. And we're going to try to make this kind of universal platform. And this is the idea behind Facebook and Twitter and all these systems, right? And then we see we see what comes of this. I mean, these platforms are used in all kinds of unexpected ways. And I don't have to go into that. I think people know from reading the news that Facebook gets, and these systems get used in a lot of very unanticipated ways. I think we need to give up on this idea of digital universalism and abandon some of the kind of profits that come with that, and maybe be guided by a different set of maybe civic values in the development of technologies, and think more about what it would look like to design local technologies that maybe aren't meant to be used everywhere. So I'll stop there.
Well, just to add to that, I mean, it seems that your work with books like yours seem to be contributing to a different perspective of how we should even start thinking of data, and how we would actually think of things like activism in terms of data protection, the necessity of encryption and things like that, which seems to be almost like a very first step towards potentially later a new distribution model of capital, I guess. But I certainly think that we're kind of in that kind of first phase where these books and this kind of way of thinking, almost a new vocabulary, and that's why I was addressing the idea of a common ground, seem to be bringing forward concepts that before we took for granted. We're just accepting platforms being for free and in a way extracting the value from us. I think that we're kind of slowly getting there, and I appreciate your contribution in that end.
And just to say one last thing, I think architecture has some great models of locality. I mean, the whole idea of, critical regionalism and, the craft practices that you all are describing, I mean, they aren't, yes, 3D printing can be applied in a lot of spaces, but you aren't doing that. You're using it in a specific place. And I think that, architects a lot of times get admonished for not having practices or products that are kind of universally or internationally distributable. But I think that there's a value in that kind of local practice. And I think we should be thinking about how more things, whether it's journalism or other kinds of practices, need to return to kind of local sites if we really want to have societies that work.
Do we have more?
Hi, thank you for your very intuitive presentations. I wanted to ask Ms. Fratello and Ms. Bhavna, you have been working on natural materials. You have been working with Adobe and you have been working with bamboo, I guess. So these materials have been used widely in the East, and they are considered to be really sustainable materials because of the quick growth of bamboo and abundant Adobe. But they haven't been used or adopted in the West, be it special material for facades or whatever. But how do you think, what do you think about the timeline that the magazine shared, that it's like 40 years we'll be living in mud houses? Is it idealistic or realistic, that timeline? In the West, not in the East. East is filled with bamboo and mud now.
Yeah, there's that amazing body of knowledge, right? And I think that, of course, in the southwest portion of the United States, for hundreds, thousands of years, the Taos Pueblo is made out of adobe, and it's the oldest continuously occupied building in the United States. People still live in it. It's thousands of years old, and it's still maintained. And I think probably within the last 30 or 40 years, the building codes in the United States have started to recognize this as a viable building material again. So it is now in the building code in New Mexico, whereas it was not 40 years ago. So I do think there is, because of the interest in sustainability, it is coming back, and there's policy around that, which will allow architects and builders to use this material again. I would say, just personally, I think maybe the reason it wasn't used for 100 years probably has to do with commercial reasons, right? So we have building codes that tell us our materials have to perform a certain way. Those materials are tested by companies who want to sell those industrialized materials. So it means materials like earth don't fit neatly into that category, right? Because you can't sell it so easily, right? But it has other values, right? It is local, it's inexpensive. I think for me, sometimes time is as valuable as money, right? And so because we're in a cash-based economy where people have to work, they don't have time to mud plaster their house, that tradition has been abandoned, right? So I think it has to do with a change in values, which is forthcoming. And I do hope that it is a reality within the next 40 years. I want to make a 3D printed house that I can live in next year. So maybe we'll see it before 40 years.
Yeah, just responding to that, I think you've hit on all of the key points there. It's really about perception of modern materials and what is a modern material, and a consideration that these more natural materials don't provide the performance required to have a good house. And so that perception is due to multiple factors. And that's what's allowed conventional materials like concrete and steel to really thrive. In terms of why we don't see bamboo houses being built, say in the US, there are a couple of examples, and they were pushed forward by adopting into a local building code the accepted performance levels. And that comes back to data. So those specific examples had to prove through laboratory testing that the material could provide the performance that the code was asking for. So it's just been a really interesting evening conversation for me, because I'm all about natural materials and data. So to really bring these non-conventional materials back into the design space, we need to understand them from a material level, but also address perception. And that perception is thinking about performance, so ensuring that we can demonstrate a bamboo structure can perform just as well as a concrete structure, but also addressing performance in terms of insurance, which often can deter someone from building a bamboo house versus a concrete block house, because there is an inherent value to the concrete house that is due to multiple economic factors. So it's a broader problem rather than just sort of wanting to build with natural materials. There's a more sort of circular approach that needs to happen to have these materials adopted into everyday practice.
We have maybe like the last final question, maybe?
I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much on behalf of the lecture committee, you guys being here and participating. This is fantastic. Maybe to our three guests, I would ask, within the context of this discussion in architecture about things that are real and things that are fake, the conversation's been in the air. I wonder, one thing I appreciated very much about each of your presentations is that there was an earnestness in the way to approach civic values with the use of material, through the use of design, through the use of digital technology. And what do you see as the pitfalls in the manipulation of data as we approach architectural design, as we approach civics right now, from the divorce between things that are real or the appearance of real and the confected and the fake.
I think expecting the data to give us the answers, this term fake is interesting because it implies that there's a real and a true. And I think data falls, in some sense, outside of it. No data are ever true. Data are always an approximation. Data are always based on assumptions. Let's come back to maybe this issue of performance. Let's say we want to judge architecture by its performance, and we want to determine whether we can use certain materials or not based on how well they perform. Well, who's to say what good performance is? We have accepted these ideas about what room temperature should be, or how long a building should be able to stand up, that are just kind of conventions, right? And these days, you expect to be able to go to, I don't know, a hotel anywhere and have the same room temperature. Well, why? Maybe, if you go to Michigan, you should put on a sweater. And you should be expected to wear a sweater around, your hotel room. And so I think kind of entrusting these ideas about like performance metrics too much, we're giving up a lot of often culturally rooted ideas about how things should be. And I think we should be questioning more often these data-driven approaches. And this, again, not to say that data are kind of evil or somehow useless, but that they're that we should treat them as cultural artifacts. And I think as architects and humanists, we kind of know how to do that. And we bring a lot of tools to this conversation and can offer a lot to the computer scientists and the data scientists.
I would just add that sometimes I feel like when there's a lot of data, we start to look at what might be the wrong thing, or we try to look at the pursuit of getting the best results out of that data. So sometimes I hear things like, I decided to make it this way because it would save each part 2 minutes less on the robot. And instead, if I would have made it this way and maybe it would have taken 4 minutes more, then I'm also using a different material that's better for the environment, and I'm making something that appears more appropriate to that, that particular community or something. So I feel like sometimes when data gets thrown in, we see it exactly in a sort of microscopic success of that data or that slant of it. We tend to not see, maybe there's other means that you would know more when we can see it a little bit more holistically. But sometimes even doing a bad job in a data set actually ends up doing the more civic or appropriate or long or enduring kind of choice.
That's a tough one for me because I don't think about what's, to me it's all real, right? If we're talking about it, it's real. But maybe for us, to your point about like, why do I have to justify to the insurance company that Adobe is not going to burn, right? There are 1,000 years of common sense and examples that tell us that. So why do I need to look at the numbers, the data sets on a piece of paper or on a computer screen? Why can't I rely on my own tacit knowledge, right? Why do I have to look at the number on the thermostat when I can feel the temperature, right? And so I think for me, those points are just as valuable as the data set, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that, which in a way ties back to our conversation about optimization. In a way, there seems to be always a conflicting criteria, right? Like when we decide to optimize one variable, somehow other one kind of drops. And so behind every decision making, there seems to be kind of a context, something else that kind of orchestrates why that system of value was there in the first place, right? It seems that in a very interesting way, like we've been touching about this idea of the optimal or kind of avenues to define systems of value in a way that often come from local communities, often need to be kind of rooted more than just as a universal or a canonical kind of statement, rather, but in a way emerge from again the communities and constituencies that we work for. So I really appreciate the conversation. Unless there's some kind of final urgent questions, I think that I would like to thank our speakers for the amazing contribution and for being really bright and exciting all night today. So thank you so much.